Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back. So we have the two more presentations related to the new innovations and pieces of research that MAIA researchers have conducted. And our first speaker comes from Greece, and the topic is biodiversity accounting. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the MAIA and all these years that we were together. I'm going to give you some of the results that we produced during the project on biodiversity accounting in Greece. Some of the main issues related on biodiversity accounting under the CA concern the scale of accounting, data availability, spatial and temporal, quantification, habitat-based biodiversity metrics, indicators, integration into current monitoring schemes. It's one of the open issues throughout Europe the last few years, and now it becomes more and more intensive. Integration into current development strategies. What we did, first of all, the case study we had, it was not the whole of Greece, it was a regional case study. It was about Peloponnesos, yes, it was about Peloponnesos, which is here, southern Greece. And this is because Peloponnesos is the more species-rich and more endemic-rich areas in Greece. We have 13 ecological floristic regions, and Peloponnesos is one of the richest in from the aspect of endemics and total species richness. That's why we have selected this area. So the first thing that we tried to develop some indicators, some proxy indicators, and the first question was related on the ecosystem extent for woodland and forests. And here you see the area covered by the ecosystem type of woodlands and forest throughout Greece. We have this scale from very high to very low, and you can see this extent of woodland forests throughout Greece. And this is the relative air cover per floristic region, which means the woodland and forest in Peloponnesos compared to for taking into consideration the ecosystem extent in the grid cell, in each grid cell, to the total ecosystem extent in a floristic region. So in Peloponnesos, you see that for each cell, which is 5 by 5, modified. No, here it is a 10 by 10, the cell, the grid cell, and this information is based on Corinne. Then we developed another indicator on total species richness in woodland and forests. Of course, in order to be able to produce such an indicator, we use the database which exists for Greece, and it is 1.2 million records for the almost 7,000 species, which is the flora of Greece. So the 7,000 plant taxa, species and subspecies are included in this 1.2 million records. You realize that this is a very good database to develop such indicators. And here again we have the number of plant species from very high to very low in the different grid cells. And here we have the relative number of species, again, per floristic region. So we consider the number of plant species within the floristic region of Peloponnesos as well as for the other areas in Greece. Here we have an indicator for biodiversity accounting based on woodland and forest extent. So here we have the total species richness, and here we have the total species richness taking into consideration the extent of the forests and woodland. And you see here the result when it is about species which are exclusively present in woodlands and forests. So this is the total richness, and these are the total richness in the woodlands and forests. And here is the plant species which are exclusively found in the woodlands and forests. This gives more importance in some of the ecosystem types. You realize that if we take into consideration the high mountain forests or the open vegetated land, which are screes and rocks above the timber line, you realize that there we have a much higher number of endemic species and unique species. So this is one indicator which gives the value of biodiversity, taking into consideration different categories of endemism: unique species, endemic species, rare species, or the total species richness. So then for the accounting and valuation, here we have we did the same for all the ecosystem types, now this time in Peloponnesus, our case study for the woodland and forest, and we have calculated the total number of species which are occurring in Peloponnesus for the woodland and forest, the same for the cropland, for the heathland and scrub, grassland, sparsely vegetated land, etc. Here we have the unique species which are only occurring in Peloponnesus at the ecosystem type of woodland and forest, how many are the regional endemics, and how many out of these endemics found in Peloponnesus within the woodland and forest ecosystem type are unique, which are not found in any other region and in this ecosystem type. So, and of course, we have also produced the relative maps for the different ecosystem types: woodland, forest, heathland, scrub, and grasslands, and all the others. Then we did an accounting and evaluation using this equation about the total biodiversity value for woodland and forest, where A area is the ecosystem type area, N is the naturalness coefficient for different types of woodland and forest areas, which means that we are not using only for the general ecosystem, but we continue on the subcategories of the ecosystem types: conifers, deciduous oak forests, etc. And then we have also this value. P is they give such a value, monetary value, 120 euros per hectare, and this is the maximum biodiversity value for woodland and forest. Of course, this is not invented by us. It is an approved ministerial decision already from 1914, taken by the Hellenic Ministry of Environment, and this is the different forest ecosystem, and based on if we have fast-growing plantations, then the coefficient of naturalness, you see, it is 0.1. But if we have a multi-story mixed high forest and riparian forest, then it is 0.9, or if these are virgin forests, now I don't know why it is here, then it is 1. So it is very natural forest. So when we are integrating the parameter of area, this gives a solution for creating accounting tables based on woodland and forest area change through time. You realize that this was approved, this was made by the Ministry of the Environment in order to have a value for restoration of disturbed or destroyed woodlands, forest, and this is especially for woodlands and forest. But in our case, we adapted this equation in order to have also an accounting and valuation of the woodlands and forests and for any region in Greece. Then we did the relative area in 2018, and the net change from 2012 up to 2018 for the different ecosystem types for Peloponnesus. This is the example given for the heathland and scrubs. And we give here the relative area. Relative area means that we compare the cover, the area of the woodlands and forest within each grid cell compared to the highest area, to the greatest area of this ecosystem type in the region of Peloponnesus. So this is how That's why we call it relative, because this is the extent within the cell compared or relatively to the total, to the highest extent of the ecosystem type in the region. And here we have also made this net change in these 7 years, and the net change, we see where the loss is and where the gain is, and when we have no change in the gray colored parts of the map. And of course, these are also the equations we have used. In this case, we did the accounting and evaluation for all the different types of ecosystems, and for these years, from 1990, 2000, 2012, and 2018, and we see the ecosystems and the percentage of each one of these ecosystems in the different years. And of course, for the past and the present period, we have also calculated based on this biodiversity value, the equation which we mentioned before, the accounting tables. And of course, we also can provide we can also predict what will happen in the future under the climatic crisis scenarios and management scenarios, and also to give the future area change. So we did also this accounting and valuation for these different years, and of course we have calculated also the biodiversity values in the different years based on the extent of the different ecosystems. Then we did the same for the Natura 2000 network sites. This is what we called before the Natura 2000 accounting in a way. So we have here the different ecosystem types, habitat types, priority habitat types, species listed under IUCN threat categories, and Annex 1 species of the Directive 92/43. Because you realize that as concerns the ecosystems, in the scale that we were working for the Natura 2000, we started from habitats, from habitat types, and then these have been transformed into ecosystems. And this can be done because we start from something more analytical in order to go in more synthetic units, because each ecosystem, of course, has many more than one habitat types. So in this case, we have divided, of course, Peloponnesos is the region, and this is divided into different prefectures. So we give also such descriptive tables giving the MAIA level 3, how many for the total, how many of these are in 2000, how many of these were in 2015. These are the two areas according to the monitoring results. These are the monitoring results for the reporting of the Annex of the Article 17 of the Directive 92/43. So we have these two different times, 2000 and 2015, and we compare for the different prefectures of Peloponnesos, MAIA level 3 ecosystems, net change, habitat types, again net change from 2000 to 2015, priority habitat types, species listed in the IUCN, threatened categories, and the net change also here, and how many different species of Annex 2 we had in 2000, 2015, and the net change. Here we see also within one example is the prefecture of Achaia, where our university is located. We see here the different prefecture of Achaia, the different ecosystem types, for example, dunes, sands, and we have species under IUCN category, then how many we have in 2015, and here we give also the net change, and the same is also in the other three columns with Annex species, Annex 1 species of the directive and Annex 1 species of directive in 2015. And here we see the net change. For example, in the natural grasslands, we have negative change, of course. In the case also of the Mediterranean sclerophyllous forest, we have also loss. And of course, the main cause of this loss might be either the forest fires, which have been taken place in the last years in 2017 and 2018, as well as in the wind parks, which are more and more intensively covering the different mountains in Greece. Then we modified the EEA reference grid cell grid for Greece, and for Peloponnesus, again, we have the number of plant taxa under the IUCN threat extinction risk categories, and the same for the number of Annex II taxa in the Peloponnese. So it means that these are as the baseline data that we have in nowadays, and then we want to create a standardized way of monitoring the species per grid cell in order that in the future we have the possibility to compare in the different time, to create a time series. Because this is, of course, the main essence behind the accounting, and to be able to compare the past with the future, and also design management measures and the implementation of management measures. Only when you have the basis to do this, and when you know the losses and the benefits of the one or the other measures, then you can also design and implement in the future. Then we did another also testing to use the alien and invasive species for the whole of Greece. We have this is the total number of alien taxa in Greece, the occurrences. Then we did the same for the 10 by 10 kilometer EA reference grid, and then we did also this for the Natura 2000 sites, again in the different periods, 2000, 2015, and 2022. So we have here, we have mapped the alien species as a disservice or as a negative element of the flora of one country. And of course we give special emphasis on the established, which is about 62% of the almost 500 alien taxa of Greece, and also on the invasive species, which are only 15. Then the last thing we did was we tried to test also out of the endemics of Peloponnesus, which are almost 500, as you see here. We tried to create a baseline for accounting of the medicinal and aromatic plants. These are useful plants in the wider sense, and that's why we tried to find out how many of the endemics of Peloponnesus have documented properties, and how many of the Peloponnesus endemics are without documented properties. Of course, we have assigned each endemic to the different habitats, and of course to the different ecosystems, and of course how many of these endemics are attributed in one of the IUCN threatened categories. And of course we have also published one article about the aromatic and medicinal plants. So here you see the different categories, because this is one, you know, we are trying to find some approaches to enhance the value, not the monetary value, of course, to enhance the value of the biodiversity and the different types of plants. So we have selected out of the endemics how many are aromatic, medicinal, traditional medicinal, antimicrobial, and how many of these have also some environmental benefit. We have reviewed almost 700 articles, and out of this we found these results: taxa with proved properties, suspected properties, proved to be absent, with documentation for the different categories. Of course, let's say for the aromatic properties, we are making such hotspot areas, so we know now in which of the mountains or other areas in Peloponnese, which is mostly on the south, we have aromatic plants with properties which are documented, and this is how we are creating such hotspots. So for food use as beverage, food preservatives or perfumes. So we have here also this information. We have created such a database, and this database is all the time improved, updated, revised on the basis of what is published in the international literature. And then we did the same, for example, for the medicinal plants and the medical properties for the different subcategories. Antioxidant, we did not remain in the main categories, but all the literature was, which is the different categories, as you see here, for skin care, bone protection, anti-malaria, etc. And again, we have such maps. Also for the traditional medicine properties, I have to finish our coordinator said so. Antimicrobials, or all the different categories are represented by different maps. And also one of the issues is the environmental benefit, which is of course a direct, in my opinion, ecosystem service, which is related on maintenance, on the maintenance regulating services. And then we compared the endemic taxa own properties and their potential properties. We tried also to compare with other plants which are similar or relatives to the endemic plants, because we have no information. So phylogenetically we tried to find out these similarities and also assign similar properties and similar services. So to finish, it seems to be feasible to integrate biodiversity accounting standards into current monitoring schemes. That's why we use the Habitats and Birds Directive. Biodiversity data can support biodiversity, ecosystem condition and ecosystem service indicators for accounting. Integration of biodiversity accounting into agricultural production standards, reporting and monitoring. It is possible also to integrate biodiversity accounting into post-fire restoration standards, reporting and monitoring, for example, by monitoring forest species. And of course, the combined accounts for biodiversity can be produced for each ecosystem type, providing a streamlined presentation for decision makers. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So, is there any questions online? No. So how about here? One quick question. We only have time for one.
Okay.
And please, can you stand up so that and introduce yourself?
Yeah, thank you. I'm Roshan Bokusheva from Zurich University of Applied Sciences. Very interesting presentation. Thank you a lot. I think it's a very valuable data you are collecting and processing. My question is, as I understood, this monitoring is not done annually, right?
No, it is done every 6 years in order to fulfill the obligations of my country as of its member state for the European Union implementation of the
In your opinion, how often it should be done then, in order to be able to really get a good overview about the situation?
This has to do with the different...
And whether there are capacities for doing so. Thank you.
That this is not the answer is not it's 4 or 5 years or 6 years, because that depends on the different types of ecosystems. For example, the wetland areas, the coastal areas, which are under high pressures, need to be monitored more frequently, which means every 2 or 3 years. But at the mountain sites, mountains, high mountain areas, which are not under high pressure, except if in the Mediterranean we say we stop grazing, which is a pressure not to have grazing in the above the timberland grasslands, or in case that we have medium mountain sites that you need about every 4 years to do some monitoring because of the intensive sometimes construction of hotels and things like that. So otherwise, all the others, the frequency ranges between 3 years and 6 years.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Unfortunately, we are running out of time, so I want to introduce our next speaker, who is Adrien from France, and we hear a presentation about marine accounting.
Thank you, Soilu. It's great to be here. Thanks a lot for the organizers. So I'm going to present what has been done on experimental marine accounts in France within the MAIA project. So it supported a lot of innovation efforts, which led to publications of first a conceptual working paper on the structuration of what we thought would be interesting and important accounts to develop in France. We also then working on a technical report for the biophysical extent and condition accounts, which are going to aggregate a lot of information, and so that's going to be a big report. We then have on the monetary accounts, because we're looking at this concept of ecological debt, liabilities, maintenance costs. We also had to develop some conceptual frameworks that could be complement what the CIEA is suggesting on valuation, and then this experimentation on actual data in the French marine economic exclusive zone. This process was not conducted only by researchers, but we also engaged a lot with decision makers in France, and so we either organized or attended a lot of meetings, workshops, and conferences, mostly trying to develop links with the French Ministry of the Environment and 3 different offices within this ministry. First, the office in charge of environmental statistics, then the office in charge of environmental economics, and also the office in charge of marine planning. And so the issues and what we attempted to do with these pieces of work was to solve a lot of different innovation needs on marine accounts. First, looking at the published scientific literature, marine accounts only account for 13% of all the ecosystems, or all the papers dealing with ecosystems accounting. There is some very interesting papers that are limited into either conceptual or very limited case studies. So there's a lot of full picture of what marine accounts could really look like. And then there's also another stream of literature on economic marine accounts, but that's not very linked to the progress of the CIEA. So for this project, we are building on a lot of different resources that are produced by academia or by public organizations in France. Mostly, we base our work on the productions for the reporting of the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, which is very interesting because it has an ecosystem approach to the management of the marine environment. We also base our publications on projects from the French Biodiversity Office, which is really the implementing body of the Ministry of the Environment, and they produced a lot of habitat maps and maps of ecosystem conditions. And we also base our studies on the French assessments of ecosystems and ecosystem services, who produced its own kind of typology of ecosystem services values, notably, which are then kind of the backbone of what research in France and applications by the Ministry of the Environment are using. So for the extent and condition accounts, so this is joint between the AgroParisTech, the International Center on the Environment and Development, and then the public policy bodies, building also the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, which is adopted in 2008 and has the ambition to achieve a good ecological status for marine waters of all European countries. And so in France, it's organized in cycles of 6 years with initial evaluations of the marine waters and economic activities, and then surveys and implementations of actions to attempt to reach this good ecological status, and then policy adjustments, so every 6 years. It's organized around descriptors that structure the good environmental status and environmental objectives that France has to achieve. So what concerns us is really the first one on biodiversity, then there's another one on non-indigenous species, and fish stocks, food webs, eutrophication, and then the integrity of the seafloor, and then there's others more linked to pollution or alterations of biological, chemical, and physical cycles of the ocean. We really wanted to develop our accounts so that they could be important and useful for decision making in France. And in France, decision making is mostly using cost effectiveness or targeting and not really cost benefit analysis. So we looked at this framework of biophysical accounts and reference conditions of biophysical accounts being then usable to produce economic accounts based on unpaid ecological cost or environmental debts that the country has contracted because it hasn't reached good ecological status. So we looked at the administrative boundaries that are used in France for the reporting of the Marine Strategy Framework Directive. So there are 4 sub-regions in France, so the Greater North Sea, the Celtic Seas, the Bay of Biscay, and the Western Mediterranean Sea. And so we use this frame of reference to produce the ecosystem accounts. We produced the extent account based on the UNIS classification of habitats. Here I display it at a quite coarse level. There's 7 here different habitats displayed, but we can go a lot higher, and we can go up to 80 or 90 different habitats that are more interesting for management of protected areas, for instance. Then the big conceptual issue was also looking at how do we define condition of marine ecosystems, taking into account plural valuations of ecosystems and the needs of management and policy making to reach those good ecological status. So the French evaluation of ecosystems and ecosystem services developed this typology of 3 different dimensions of the condition of ecosystems with heritage, which is looking at non-instrumental values, conservation of places and species. Then functionality, which is supposed to take into account the complexity, the resilience of the systems, and then the capacity to provide ecosystem services. And then we mapped the different descriptors of the MSFD, Strategy Framework Directive, onto those 3 dimensions of that conceptual framework. So we then looked at what would be the data sets that are available and that are spatially explicit to then construct the accounts per se. And so what we see is that for the functionality dimension, and there's a lot of gaps in what is monitored, so that's already interesting to see that there's currently little done to really understand how marine ecosystems function and how they could change and maybe pass tipping points in the future because of climate change, for instance. So we could then produce maps. So for instance, here, this is the integrity of the seafloor, which is approximated using all the physical impacts that is done by economic activities. So that could be dredging, anchoring, stuff like that. And this could be interesting if we then map it on top of the ecosystem extent, looking at protected species, for instance, so merle beds or seagrass beds. And we see huge differences. So this could be relevant for policy, where merle beds are very protected and they fall into the categories of low or nil risk of seafloor integrity, whereas seagrass beds are very threatened and fall into the high risk category. Then what we want to do is to produce ecological data accounts. So we look at how data sets monitor also the status or the reaching of goals of good ecological status for the marine environment. And here what we see is that it's very difficult to set historical or not historical, but anyway, good ecological status for the heritage dimensions. For biodiversity, it's hard to set targets on their actual state. But on the other hand, it's easier for the capacity of ecosystem services. So here we have 2 examples. The first one is for eutrophication, where there are levels of pollutants that are set. And so here we can see that we've mapped it for the 4 sub-regions and for the whole France exclusive economic zone. So for the Celtic seas, that there's the most surface that hasn't reached the good ecological status so far. And then the second example is on fish stocks, where here it's harder to deconstruct it by sub-regions, so it's by fish stocks. And so here we see that there's a lot of fish stocks that is overfished. So based on these, we can attempt to look at the ecological debts in monetary terms. And so we use different types of costs. So we use the cost of monitoring those variables, the cost of preventing environmental degradation, and then the cost of restoring degraded ecosystems. And we were able to do this for 3 different descriptors of the MSFD. So for biodiversity, I said that it's very hard to set targets. So what we use is not targets, but it's budgeting from the public offices what they think we should spend to protect biodiversity. And then for fishing stocks and for eutrophication, we use the targets that I've shown previously in terms of reaching good ecological status. And we use the simplest model with a linear relationship between the costs and the achievement of good ecological status. So what we see is that for eutrophication, there's most of the cost is already spent, but there is unpaid ecological costs, so that's in yellow. And mostly for the Celtic seas, because that's where there's a lot of pollution. And then for fishing, the cost is a lot higher, and the debt is a lot higher, mostly because there's a lot of fish stocks that are not within a good ecological status. And so the cost for fishing is also higher than the cost for eutrophication, with a total debt of around 200 million euros per year. So that's the synthesis, and we've done that also for biodiversity. So we have estimates for all those different descriptors, but there's also potential interactions, so we cannot really aggregate those costs, and this is mostly for to give big bundle figures to see how much we should be spending to protect the ocean. So we then had this kind of conceptual exercise on, we are producing all those ecosystem accounts, but are they useful? What can they be used for? And so potentially they could be really interesting because there's a lot of issues around marine spatial planning, for instance, looking at where to put windmill farms or stuff like that. And so that's becoming a big issue, and there's not a lot of aggregated data to be able to inform decisions, so the accounts could be really interesting to do that. And then on the economic accounts, those could be also interesting to help decision making, to set resource mobilization efforts, or to look at innovative policy instruments if we have to pay this debt. So that's the theory, but then in practice, when we had the last national workshop, we asked people whether they thought that those accounts would be actually integrated into policymaking, and we didn't get a lot of yes. Some for the biophysical accounts, so out of 15 people that are really decision makers, we asked them from 1 to 10 if they think those accounts would be integrated into decision. And most thought that it was going to be a no, but some thought that it was really important to have them. And then for the monetary accounts, they thought that it would probably never be used in policymaking. And so that kind of brings us to this point now where marine accounts are not really on the political agenda, and that's also because Eurostat will not require marine accounts for the reporting, and so the statistics office that are very resource constrained, they're just not going to do it if they don't have to do it. And then on the opposite, for the integrated marine policy, they really are doing their own thing, and so they're not really connected to the ecosystem accounting work. So it could be also interesting to try to integrate all those different processes that are in silos. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So now we have some time for questions. And is there any questions online? No? Okay, so we have a question here. Can you stand up and present yourself?
Burkhard Schwepper-Kraft from the Federal Agency for Nature Conservation in Germany. I think Germany and France are the only MAIA partners who try to value biodiversity also monetarily. And we did it in different ways, but they are more or less, they have the possibility to come together. Had you some ideas to take also the time needed for reconstruction of ecosystems into account? For if you do not maintain an ecosystem, you do not spend the money for it, okay, then you have a debt if you should have this ecosystem. But there are differences. Some ecosystems can be very easily reconstructed, and some take a very long time to be reconstructed, so that there should be differences between them. We try to solve it with a procedure that is also used in the USA for valuing the ecological debt. What are your ideas upon it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So here we used, public budgeting that doesn't take into account the time of restoration and the difference in, the gap of condition that goes up in a long time. But there's, the compensation, biodiversity offsetting and compensation, I think has ways to integrate this into the values that they calculate. And I think maybe Harold actually has some ideas about that.
Harold Levrel, AgroParisTech. In the United States, there are some tools like the habitat equivalency analysis, which help to have an a long-term assessment of the ecological recovery. It means that for each year there are some increase of the component that you target, and it can take decades, in fact. And in my opinion, there are some specific components of biodiversity which are not accountable. I mean, you cannot compensate a loss if it's a very hard forest or some coral reefs which need centuries for being recovered. So it's maybe the limit of the ecological accounting in this way. You cannot take into account all the kind of impacts. But yes, sorry? Here we have some, we don't have, I guess, some biodiversity components which are some long life cycle habitats or species, but of course it's a important question. But yes, it's possible to have a kind of life cycle analysis regarding the time scale required to have the complete recovery of habitats or species in the analysis. But we didn't do it at this stage.
Okay, thank you. So I think we will have one final question.
Yeah, so David Barton from the Norwegian Institute for Nature Research. Thanks so much for the presentation. I was very, very disappointed by the last slide with the lack of belief in uptake, especially when you made an effort to try to adjust the approach for monetary evaluation to the French institutional context. I would have hoped the scale was further to that side. So my question is really, moving forward, what do you feel you can do to make this approach to monetary accounting move the scale to the other side? What are the measures that you as a researcher, your colleagues can do in France?
Yeah, I think, I mean, we have these like big masses and kind of not very comprehensive assessments that were a first step to understand, you know, what kind of accounts could be produced and using what kind of techniques. But then if we look at specific policies, and so in Clément's PhD, actually, he looked at specific policies like no net loss of natural places, or the attainment of good ecological status for specific streams. Then you have values that are directly actionable by policymakers, and so potentially that's easier for them to grasp and to see. But one of the issues is that this is not even discussed in the CEA, so like most people that we surveyed are like, well, yeah, but we have to report CEA stuff, so if it's not in there, then we're not going to do it.
Okay, thank you, Adrien. And now it's the end of today's session, so I want to thank all the presenters and all our audience here and also online, and our technical support here as well. And tomorrow morning we will start 9 a.m. Brussels time, and perhaps we will greet our great presenters once more by applause. So thank you.